so much for having me. So my name is Dr. Angela Muir, and I'm a lecturer in British social and cultural history at the University of Leicester. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is, first of all, studying history at Leicester, but mostly I'm going to be talking to you about some of my own research to give you a sense of one of the many things you can study if you decide to study history at Leicester. So why should anyone study history at university? Well, we've heard from some of you that you have clear ideas of that already, but there really are a range of reasons why you should. And first of all, knowing about the past is essential to understanding how and why society got to be where it is today. And this knowledge helps us to make better informed decisions about the future. And it also helps us to better understand concepts like change over time, the longer term impact and consequences of human actions. And it helps us to appreciate different societies and cultures and how they've operated over time. And it's also just an incredibly interesting topic that a lot of people love studying, not just at university, but throughout their lives. And often people want to study something that they have a personal connection to, which is, of course, completely valid. Now, at a more practical level, the discipline of history provides students with a range of relevant skills that employers look for, and history graduates are sought after in many different fields. Obviously, some of the people who study history to go on to be professional historians and lecturers like myself, but many more go on to other fantastic careers in law, education, marketing, recruitment, the public sector, and some even go on to establish their own successful businesses. Now, some of these careers may, of course, be things that you're interested in, but you may not really have an idea of what you want to do after you graduate. And what's great about studying history is it sets you up well to pursue any number of careers, because it gives you a skill set that employers are looking for across countless sectors. Now, what sort of skills are these? Well, some of the skills you can develop through studying history include analytical reading, research and writing skills, data analysis, critical thinking, and loads of other things as well. So it's not just about studying and interpreting the past, but it's also about developing skills that can help you solve real world problems. So to give you just a bit of a personal example, I did my undergraduate degree in Canada a long time ago. And before I started my PhD over here, I did a range of different jobs, all of which were different career paths. I worked as an arts events coordinator in a performing arts department of a university in Canada. I worked as a fundraising manager for a substance misuse charity. And I also worked as a funding officer for an organization that gives money to charities. And in all of those jobs, I applied the skills that I developed as a history undergraduate, which included critical analysis, research, and writing convincingly. All of those are things that you develop studying history at university. So of course, history does more than just teach you about the past, it sets you up for your own future. Now, in terms of history at Leicester, now we're part of a broader school of history, politics, and international relations. So in our school, we actually combine some of the interests that those of you here have today. And we have one of the largest departments in the UK, which means we can offer modules in a range of different topics covering numerous geographic areas and time periods. We offer modules in British and European history, American history, African history, Indian history, Chinese history, Latin American history, and much more. So some of our modules have a political emphasis as well, which means you can study things like fascism, communism, the Cold War, civil rights, and American politics. But other modules, such as the ones that I teach, take on a more social and cultural approach to studying the past. And I focus on things including gender, deviance, as well as society and culture. And because we're based in a school with politics and international relations, we also offer students different joint degree options. So you can study history alongside politics, alongside international relations. You can do history and American studies, or you can minor in several other humanities and social science subjects. Or of course, you can just take history as a single honor subject as well. You don't have to take it alongside something else, but those are options that are there if you want them. And now our teaching staff are actively engaged in cutting edge research, and 85% of this has been rated as world leading by this analysis we go through every 5 years called the Research Excellence Framework. So 85% of the research done by historians at Leicester is considered world leading. And we bring our passion for research into our teaching, which means our lectures and seminars are engaging and innovative and relevant. And you also have a fairly high degree of one-to-one contact with your lecturers as well. So you're not left stranded just to learn on your own. Now, as I mentioned, the size of our department and the diversity of our teaching and research staff means we can offer a huge range of option modules in the second and third year. And these cover time periods from the medieval to the modern and geographic areas from Britain and Europe to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. We also have active research centers exploring topics such as imperial, global, and post-colonial history, genocide and Holocaust studies, urban history, and local history. And we encourage our students to get involved as much as possible, or as much as they like, in these research centers. So students have opportunities outside of the traditional classroom as well. Now, I'm not going to say much more about our specific offerings at Leicester, but if you have any questions or if you want to learn more, there's plenty of information on our website, or you're more than welcome to ask me questions and to get in touch if you'd like to have a chat. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. So that's a really quick rundown of history at Leicester. Now, what I'm going to do now is shift gears and tell you a little bit about my own research. Now, not only is this research that I carry out in the archives and write about, I also incorporate a lot of this into my teaching as well. As a social and cultural historian, I'm interested in understanding the lives, experiences, beliefs, and values of men and women in the past who didn't have a lot of political power, but whose lives were interesting and important nonetheless. So rather than studying the actions and lives of kings and queens and politicians or the rich and powerful, I'm interested in the lives of our contemporaries in the past. Now, it could be that some of us here are descended from royalty or highly influential people in the past, but odds are most of us come from fairly humble origins. And it's this history of the average people that I'm interested in, including those at the margins of society. So not just the, quote unquote, every man or every woman, but those whose experiences may have been different because of who they were or who they were seen to be. So religious and ethnic minorities, people whose sexual identities didn't conform, those with chronic illnesses or disabilities, as well as those living in extreme poverty who had to resort to illegal or semi-legal activities just to survive. And a project that I'm currently working on explores diversity and marginalization and social change during the 18th and 19th centuries. And one of the things that historians are becoming increasingly aware of is just how diverse Britain was in earlier centuries. But that would have to be a subject of a different talk, because what I'm going to talk to you about today focuses more on how young men and women from the lower orders of society dated and even hooked up in earlier centuries. So I'm trying to keep this as PG as possible, but maybe buckle up a little bit. Now, the lives and experiences of those lower down the social order are often the hardest to get at. And I'm going to give you a taste of some of the ways in which historians like me go about getting at certain very personal aspects of people's lives in the past. And I'm going to do this by focusing specifically on courtship. And what I mean by courtship is the customs and rituals that young men and women engaged in the process of getting married. Now, if you think this in any way will resemble a Disney film or a rom-com, think again, because one of the best sources for courtship amongst the lower orders in the past is through criminal court records. And this isn't because courtship customs were illegal, but because some of the best and often only records that we have are a result of when courtship went wrong, sometimes horribly wrong. Now, before I get to that, I'll tell you just a little bit more about the research I was doing that led me to this, just to give you an idea of rabbit holes that you sometimes go down as a researcher. Now, my specific area of research and teaching is, of course, the social and cultural history of England and Wales, mainly in the 18th century. And I'm especially interested in topics relating to women, gender, poverty, childbirth, and deviance, or behaviors that some would label deviant. And most of my research has focused on Wales during the 18th century. Now, the question I often get with that is, why Wales? Well, the main reason is it's one of the most understudied parts of Britain, which makes it essentially a blank canvas and free playing field for historians who want to explore something new, because so few people have looked at it. Now, the bulk of my research has looked at the causes and consequences of illegitimacy in Wales from the late 17th through to the early 19th centuries. And by illegitimacy, I mean children born to women who were not married, or at least weren't married to the father of the child. You know, a lot of people think that in the past, it wasn't common for men and women to become romantically involved and intimate prior to marriage. But despite what you may think about prudish attitudes in the past and waiting until you're married, it was actually far more common than you may think. Having a child before you were married was certainly frowned upon, but it wasn't uncommon. And in some circumstances, it was completely acceptable for a bride to be pregnant at the time of her marriage. However, any number of circumstances could prevent a pregnant woman from marrying the child's father. This could range from them being able to not being able to afford to get married and start their own household, or the father dying before they reach the altar, or the father running away and abandoning the woman and child. And it could also involve a father lying about being able to, or even being willing to marry the woman. And in these instances, a child born to one of these relationships would be considered illegitimate. And because these children were born outside of traditional family units, they were more at risk of poverty and hardship. So parishes kept records of who these children were and who could or should be held financially responsible for them. Now, because we have a lot of information about illegitimacy in the past, that allows us to calculate how many children were born outside of marriage and see how this changed over time and varied between different places. Historians have calculated that in England, around the year 1700, about 2% of children who were baptized were illegitimate. So really not that many. But by 1800, this had risen to about 5%. And this still sounds like a relatively small number, but this is a national average and could vary quite a bit regionally. And in some parts of England, it was significantly higher than that 5%. And the same trend is also apparent in Wales, but the big difference with Wales is that overall levels of illegitimacy were quite a bit higher, especially at the end of the century, where about 8% of all infants baptized were illegitimate. But this could be as high as 20% in some parishes. So at the end of the 18th century, 20% of infants baptized in some Welsh parishes were born to parents who weren't married. So that is significant. So what does this all mean? Well, if you're an official report writer from Westminster, you think this demonstrates serious immorality and deviance on the part of the Welsh peasantry. But in reality, it's of course far more complicated and interesting. Now, of course, this also depends on what we mean by deviance. And if we define deviance as a deliberate behavior that goes against accepted social norms, then most of this illegitimacy probably isn't deviant, although some contemporaries certainly thought so. And undoubtedly, some illegitimacy did result from things like sex work and adultery that many would deem deviant. But in reality, it's of course very complicated. And a lot of illegitimacy likely had nothing to do with intentional attempts to subvert the social order. Now, through my research, I found that most illegitimacy in Wales was caused by a combination of premarital courtship customs that created an opportunity for couples to be intimate, and very poor economic circumstances that prevented them from getting married because they just simply couldn't afford to. That said, some illegitimacy, of course, did involve deviance. And when that deviance not only challenged social norms, but also laws, it ends up in court records. And that's where we get really, really interesting evidence. And I'm going to share some of that with you today. And I'm going to talk to you about 3 different court cases, all of which reveal fascinating insight into courtship in the past. And what's really interesting about studying things like this and studying deviance in this way is considering how societies define what is and is not deviant, how they try and regulate it, how they try and punish or correct what's deemed deviant. And also by looking at evidence of what's considered deviant, you can deduce what sorts of things were considered acceptable, normal, or even just important, as well as the sort of things that people just were generally getting up to. And what's also fascinating and revealing about things like this is that we sometimes expect certain behaviors in the past to be heavily condemned, and they aren't. And this just shows that sometimes we have a lot of assumptions about the past that aren't necessarily true. Now, as I said, one of the best places to find out about everyday activities in the past, especially as they relate to lower orders of society who couldn't read or write, let alone afford paper and ink, are through court records. And although these are sometimes formulaic and details written in things like depositions and witness examinations and confessions, were usually written by court officials and not the individual in question. So they're rarely verbatim, but they are still quite revealing. When people describe what they were doing when a crime took place, they often left a record of typical routine activities that historians can then use to reconstruct everyday life. So for example, If any of you gave evidence about a crime that you witnessed and you told police that you were on your mobile chatting with a friend when you saw events unfold, a historian in the future could use that to know what young people today were doing. They would know that young people used mobile phones to communicate with their peers. And of course, this might seem obvious to us, but if you're not of a particular culture, things like this aren't that obvious. And it's these seemingly irrelevant details that can reveal quite a lot. Now, what I'd like to do now is walk you through these 3 cases from Wales in the 18th and 19th centuries to show you what they can reveal about how British people courted in the past, and also give you a bit of a taste of many of the things you can learn about if you choose to come and study at the University of Leicester. And I'm sorry if you could hear that. My cat just threw up on the carpet. So apologies, but I'll deal with that later. Impeccable timing. Anyway, so all of the cases I'm going to show you now relate to men and women who weren't married to each other, who were either engaging in, or at least attempting to engage in, premarital sex with at least some intention or perceived intention of getting married. Now, spoiler alert, because these are all in court records, they didn't end well. And one of the reasons I've looked for courtship customs in Welsh court records is because of this high level of illegitimacy I just mentioned, but also because there's certain customs that outsiders, mainly the English, attribute to the Welsh, which there's actually very little firsthand evidence of. And these are rituals that were portrayed as ancient, quaint Welsh folk customs. And they were written by people like English travel writers traveling through the Welsh countryside. But we actually know some of those writers never set foot in Wales and were just writing based on rumors. And we also have reports of some of these customs that I'll tell you about that come to us from official government reports, or reports commissioned by the government in the 1830s, which were more interested in reforming certain aspects of Welsh society and making the Welsh more English than they were about actually recording Welsh customs. And so these things were written down in really, really judgmental ways. It's part of sort of a colonial process. Now, again, it's not clear if those who were writing about these actually had any firsthand knowledge of them. But that's sort of a starting point, is this question of, well, did this actually happen? Now, this courtship ritual that I'm talking about, which most of you probably haven't heard of, but it's associated with Wales, and it's something called bundling, or courting at night, and it has names in Welsh as well. And this is where young unmarried couples would sit up together at night alone. And it's called bundling because there's this idea that you would actually bundle the woman up into a blanket or sack and stitch it up sort of to the neck, so that everything from the neck down was off limits. And we don't actually know how common this part of it was. And often courtship took place in a woman's home and would involve a young man sneaking into the woman's home, presumably with her consent, and spending the night. Her parents or masters, if the young woman was a domestic servant, would allow it to take place by turning a blind eye. And this was something that was really only supposed to happen in the later, more serious stages of courtship, when it was apparent that a couple was actually going to get married. Now, with young men and women who are into each other, spending the night together unsupervised, we can only imagine what they were getting up to. And so bundling, which is what I'm talking about here, is this ritual that travel writers and report writers from England included in their descriptions and practices of the Welsh people. But is there any evidence of this that comes from the Welsh people themselves? Well, yes, and that's where these records come in. So all of the cases I'm going to talk about were tried at the Welsh Court of Great Sessions, which is the equivalent to the English Assizes or the Old Bailey. So it's the highest criminal court. It heard the most serious criminal offences, and it was the only court in Wales that could hand out the death sentence. So the first case. Now, this is also the most recent. It's from 1823, and it's from the island of Anglesey. So in April of this year, a labourer named Griffith Roberts was charged with burglary with intent. Now, several witnesses in this case gave evidence, including Griffith himself. And each deposition provides the same revealing narrative. According to records, Griffith had been drinking at a local pub until about 1 o'clock in the morning. After that, he walked to the home of a man named William Griffith, where a young woman named Jane Owen worked as a servant. Once he reached the home, he took off all of his clothing except for his breeches. He slid open a sash window and crawled inside. Now, Griffith quickly learned that in his drunken stupor, he accidentally crawled through the window of the master of the house and his wife. rather than the window of his intended target. Now, William awoke in a start and was able to quickly restrain Griffith, while the rest of the household awoke and contacted the local constable. Griffith was arrested and charged with burglary, and in his defense, he said that he had been in the custom of courting Jane, the servant girl, and that his intention was to crawl through her bedroom window and not William's. Now, Jane also provided a witness statement. On this night, she said that she was awakened by the sound of another member of the household, and she went to investigate and found her master restraining Griffith, who, at first, she said she didn't recognize. However, after a few moments, she realized it was Griffith Roberts, who she said she had courted, who had courted her about 3 times a few months previously. And during that time, he had been in the habit of crawling through her window to see her, or she would let him in through the door when no one was looking, and then they would, and I quote, court in bed, which another servant corroborated. So it would appear that what we have here is a straightforward case of a former boyfriend drunkenly seeking out the affections of his former lover late one night. However, it's not quite that straightforward. Although both Griffith and Jane admitted to having a history of courting each other at night, Jane said that at the time he had told her that he was a single man, and so she accepted his advances. But, and this is a big but, it turns out that this whole time, Griffith was actually a married father of 1. Once being informed of this, Jane stopped seeing him. So Griffith was not, in fact, genuinely courting Jane and was instead committing adultery. Now, we're all human, and I can imagine we all have opinions about Griffith's actions. But as academic historians, it's not our place to really judge people in the past the way we might judge the people around us today. So what's academically interesting for a historian like me is not the scandalous details of a married man carrying out a nighttime affair with another woman, but the fact that Griffith was able to use a courtship custom as a defense for his breaking and entering in the first place. Had this practice of bundling not existed in this area, it would have made no sense for him to try and use this to justify his actions. So from this case, we can deduce that courting at night was likely a legitimate practice for young couples, at least in this area. So that's the first case. Now, we can also find evidence of this sort of custom in the records of other more serious crimes as well. And the next case I'd like to tell you about is unfortunately considerably more grim than the last one. And this is a case that comes to us from Carmarthenshire in 1816. And it involves a 19-year-old farmer's daughter named Elizabeth Jones and a young preacher and farmer named Rhys Thomas Rhys. Now, Rhys doesn't appear to have provided a statement, or if he did, it hasn't survived. But we do know from all of the witness statements collected during the pretrial process that Rhys had been paying his addresses to Elizabeth for approximately 2 years before she suddenly fell violently ill and was taken to bed and ultimately died several days later. Now, in the time between when Elizabeth fell ill and when she died, she was able to tell her family about how she came to be so gravely ill. Elizabeth's mother, father, and sister all provided statements saying that they had known Rhys relatively well because he had been visiting the household in the 2 years leading up to Elizabeth's death. During this time, they said that Rhys had sat up with Elizabeth in the kitchen of the home, often at night and often all night long, and I quote, for the purposes of courting her as is customary in the country. During these visits, the young couple were likely left alone as Elizabeth ultimately became pregnant. When she found this out, she informed Rhys, as well as her family, and presumably she thought this revelation would prompt Rhys to propose marriage. We don't know how her family reacted to the news, but we do know that Rhys was not exactly excited about these prospects. Instead, he decided to take matters into his own hands and remedy the situation in a pretty terrible way. Now, a few days after hearing the news, Rhys paid a visit to a local surgeon named Joseph Yeomans. Joseph provided Rhys with a grey liquid, which was likely a mixture of mercury, arsenic, and other toxic substances that were believed to induce a miscarriage. On the night in question, Elizabeth's father said he and the rest of the family went to bed around 10 o'clock at night, leaving Elizabeth and Rhys alone in the kitchen of the home. According to her deathbed confession, Rhys spent at least an hour trying to convince Elizabeth to consume this liquid, which she was reluctant to do. However, Rhys grew more and more persistent, and finally she gave in and drank it, fearing that if she didn't, he would just force it on her. And immediately after consuming the substance, Elizabeth said she felt a searing heat like a flame of fire in her throat and her chest, and cried out that she knew he had given her something that would kill her. Rhys then fled the house, taking the empty bottle with him. Shortly after, Elizabeth's sister Gwen found her face down on the floor in a pool of sick and blood and called out for their parents. And they lifted her off the floor and helped her to bed, where she remained until she died. On her deathbed, Elizabeth also told her parents that she had neither finger nor fault in her own death, and that it was the substance that Thomas Rhys had given her that caused her to be so ill. She also told them that after learning about her pregnancy, Rhys attempted on at least 2 other occasions to persuade Elizabeth to consume a bottle of liquid, which she refused to do. Apparently, Rhys told her that the substance was for purging the blood, which, as an aside, tells us a bit about medical understandings and practices in this part of Wales at this time. The idea of purging the blood, which we also see in practices like bloodletting, comes from an ancient understanding of the body called the humoral system, which is all about finding the right balance of bodily fluids to promote health. And this understanding was very much in decline by the 19th century, but it did persist in many areas, including, apparently, this part of Wales. And we see that in this description of the alleged curative properties of this substance. So, anyway, Rhys asked if Elizabeth had taken the substance that he had previously given her, and she said yes, but of course, she hadn't taken it at all. And astonished that she seemed so unaffected, Rhys allegedly visited Joseph Yeomans again, and this time asked for a stronger mixture, which is ultimately the mixture that Elizabeth did drink. Now, before drinking the poison, Elizabeth asked if it would make her ill enough to require a doctor. And of course, this was before the NHS, and doctors at the time were expensive, so it could be that Elizabeth was wary of incurring a costly medical bill for her family to pay. Rhys assured her that if she did need a doctor, he would provide one. And, true to his word, after hearing how ill she was, but before Elizabeth revealed what had happened to her, Rhys hired the services of Joseph Yeomans, who attended to Elizabeth and determined that she had a bout of colic and quinsy, and quinsy is tonsillitis, and gave her a spoonful of another substance in a small bottle with instructions to take it every 2 hours. And we don't know what that other substance was, but apparently her parents didn't administer it to her as instructed, likely because they were skeptical of this doctor and his connections to Rhys. The family later decided to hire a surgeon who instructed the family to give her as much milk as she could drink and provided a couple of topical remedies, but to no avail. And milk is often a common substance used to try and counteract poison. Elizabeth's father stated that in the week prior to his daughter falling ill, she told him that she was pregnant. After she got sick, he called Rhys into the house and asked if he had seduced his daughter, and he said he didn't. He then asked Rhys if he had given his daughter any liquid that caused her illness, which Rhys denied. Her father then said that if he had, he would see him hanged for it because she had taken ill. And an acquaintance of both Rhys and Elizabeth also provided evidence saying that after Elizabeth fell ill, Rhys came to him in a very worried state, and although Rhys didn't confess to anything, he apparently repeatedly said that he had not intended to cause harm to anyone. And a neighbor named Gwyn also provided evidence saying that she had visited Elizabeth daily during her illness, and on one occasion witnessed her having a fit. Once she had revived from the fit, Elizabeth asked her to call for her sister, and when her sister came in, Elizabeth said for her to take warning at her situation, and then said nothing more. So after languishing for 8 days, Elizabeth succumbed to the effects of the poison and died. Rhys was charged with murder and at trial was convicted and sentenced to death, just like Elizabeth's father had promised. And although this is a horrible and far from romantic case, which contains some rather graphic descriptions of the damage the poison did to Elizabeth's body, which I'm not going to go into, it does still provide historians with evidence about the types of courtship activities that young Welsh couples were engaging in. From both of these cases, we know that some young couples did spend the night together, and this appears to have been generally accepted by families under the right circumstances. This could involve a man sneaking into a bedroom through a window, or could involve a man being invited in to sit in less private spaces, such as a kitchen, but then being left without supervision. Under either of these circumstances, a young couple had the opportunity to be intimate if they wanted to, and although it would appear that this wasn't necessarily encouraged. Now, thinking in terms of deviance, Young men sneaking through women's windows at night, or couples sitting up all night unsupervised, certainly sounds like something that I imagine most parents would probably call deviant. But in 18th and 19th century Wales, it was a generally accepted practice if everything went to plan. So it can hardly be seen as deviant. Even the act of couples getting a bit too close or closer than their parents would have liked was not necessarily deviant, as the expectation was that this was a normal step on the process to marriage. So any child conceived would still be born within marriage because that would take place before the child was born. But those more mundane cases where the couple actually did marry just haven't ended up being written in historical records because they were a routine occurrence and very few people would have documented it because this was something that would have been common lower down the social order. And the reason these two cases ended up in court wasn't because of the courtship practice itself, but because the practice didn't follow the unwritten social rules. And by looking at these relatively rare cases where it went wrong, we can understand what likely did happen in countless other situations where it just went to plan. Okay, the final case I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit different. In this case, it's not necessarily about courtship practices, but it does still reveal, or the same courtship practices, it reveals other courtship practices and other details of day-to-day life that we might not always consider. So in 1799, a young servant woman from Anglesey named Elizabeth Owen was brought before the magistrates accused of skulking about the parish of Llanfaelog and violently suspected of maliciously and feloniously setting fire to a haystack, 2 corn stacks, a cart house, and its contents, which were the property of a young widow named Ellen Owen, who lived at a place called Pensairi in the parish of Llanfaelog. And it's worth bearing in mind that this is a rural, relatively remote part of Anglesey scattered with farms. Now, this is also interesting because women aren't often associated with violent property crimes such as arson, but several witnesses apparently had good reason to suspect that Elizabeth had set this fire. Now, some of the people who lived in properties nearby stated they saw or encountered a woman who looked like Elizabeth Owen. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 20th of October, 1799, a man named Owen Williams deposed that the accused, who he didn't know at the time, came to his door and asked him how far it was to Pensairi. Owen and his wife told the woman that the property was about 3/4 of a mile away. They also stated that this woman was wearing a blue cloak, a beaver hat, and a spotted shawl with a kerchief about her head. Owen then deposed that about 3 hours later, the same person passed his house again with the hood pulled over her head, and he bid the woman good night, and she replied with the same. Another witness, named John David, who did know the accused, said he saw her walking in the general direction of the property in question, but they didn't exchange words. But he confirmed that Elizabeth was wearing a blue cloak, a beaver hat, and a spotted shawl. A further witness, named John Williams, deposed that at dusk on that evening, he saw the corn stack was on fire, and he asked a woman he met about 100 yards from the house, going rather hastily between running and walking, what the cause of the fire was, to which she replied she didn't know. And although John didn't know the woman, after hearing the voice of Elizabeth, he was convinced it was the same woman he passed that evening. Another witness, named William Chambers, who helped to extinguish the fire, asked around and was told by several others that a strange woman was observed in the neighborhood and that the cart house and the corn stacks were about 20 or 30 yards apart. So it would appear that the two fires were set separately and intentionally, rather than spreading naturally between the two. Now, a woman named Ellen Jones also provided a witness statement. She and her husband lived about a field's distance from Pensairi and said that on the night of the 20th of October, a woman who matched the description of Elizabeth Owen came to her house and asked for some fire in a wisp of straw, which she had brought with her in her hand. Ellen asked the woman where she lived, to which this woman replied, at no great distance. And so Ellen gave her a piece of turf with some fire in it. And it was about 10 minutes after that that the fire was discovered in the corn stack in the cart house belonging to Ellen Owen. Now, as an aside, this last point provides just some interesting small details about day-to-day life in earlier centuries. Fire, of course, was central to cooking and heating, but items such as matches and lighters wouldn't have been readily available. In addition to providing evidence in a criminal case, this interaction also shows us some of the ways in which individuals could and did turn to each other for help with basic necessities, such as fire. And the practical details of these exchanges, like using straw or turf to transport flames from one hearth to another. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that. So we have two fires that appear to have been set deliberately to one person's property. In the lead up to these fires, several witnesses saw the same strange woman in the area, and the same woman asks for and is provided with fire a short time before a fire breaks out. Now, Elizabeth was questioned, and she accounted for her whereabouts on that day by saying that she had asked her master, Humphrey Williams, for permission to leave and go see her cousin. The property where Elizabeth lived and worked as a servant was in the parish of Llantrisant, which was approximately 8 miles from Pensire, so potentially about 2.5 to 3 hours away by foot. She said that she stayed at her cousin's for about an hour and then set out walking for about 2 hours in the general direction of, but nowhere actually near, Pensire. When it started to get dark, she claimed that she asked for lodging in someone's home, and she was welcomed in and allowed to bunk in with their female servants. And this practice of taking in a lodger at night when they're stranded at dusk appears to have been fairly common, especially for lone female travelers. Now, Humphrey Williams was Elizabeth's master, and he was a yeoman farmer. What this means is he was a farmer who owned the property that he farmed. Now, this isn't a measure of wealth because you could be a yeoman with a very small plot of land or a very, very large one. So there was a significant variety that this term covered. The documents we have relating to this case don't really tell us very much about Humphrey, but he probably was around the lower to middle part of the spectrum. Now, Humphrey was examined by the courts and deposed that Elizabeth had indeed asked him for leave to visit her cousin around 1:15 in the afternoon on the 20th of October, and stated that she didn't return until the following morning. He also deposed that she had been wearing a blue cloak, a beaver hat, and a kerchief. So we have a crime, we have a suspect, we have opportunity, we have witnesses, but what don't we have? We don't have motive, and this is where it gets really interesting. Ellen Owen, the woman whose property was set alight, stated in her complaint that she had just cause to suspect Elizabeth Owen of voluntarily and maliciously setting fire to her corn and haystacks and her cart house. But her statement doesn't reveal why she suspected this. However, two other statements do provide a glimpse of what Elizabeth's motives may have been. Mary Jones, who was a fellow servant in Elizabeth's household, or in Humphrey Williams' household, was examined and deposed that Elizabeth had told them that their master, so Humphrey Owen, had been paying his addresses to Ellen Owen, which means Humphrey was courting Ellen. And the evidence for this is that Humphrey was in possession of Ellen's garters. Now, garters are a very personal item that even today we associate with certain marriage rituals. Now, how Humphrey came into the possession of Ellen's garters, we can't exactly know, but I'm pretty sure we can all guess. Plus, we know from other documents that one of the central features of early modern courtship across Britain was the exchange of gifts, sometimes small tokens. And this was part of the promise or a statement of your intentions and desire to get married. And that the garters, which are such a personal item, were gifted, suggests that there may have been a level of intimacy between these two as well. And as we've seen, premarital intimacy between courting couples wasn't really all that uncommon in Wales. And I don't really think it takes much imagination to think of what might have been going on to lead a man into coming into possession of the undergarments of a woman he was dating. So these few lines in a court document reveal quite a bit about cultural practices. So, but why would Elizabeth care that Humphrey was paying his addresses to Ellen? Mary also deposed that Elizabeth had described Ellen as a mean person like herself, which means she thought her and Ellen were of similar status. Now, what that means in relation to Humphrey's status, we can't know, but this does suggest that Elizabeth saw herself as a potential contender for Humphrey's affections. And it may seem odd that a servant might have thought herself eligible of her master's affections, but this wasn't uncommon, especially in rural parts of Britain, for masters to marry their servants, often because their servants were young people from families of similar status who were just simply gaining experience and saving a bit of money to set up their own households. So, did Elizabeth set these fires out of jealousy because she was a scorned party in a love triangle? Well, evidence given by William Chambers, who helped to put out the fire, shed some considerable light on this. William deposed that he had been told by others that Humphrey was treating at marriage with Ellen Owen, which of course we knew from Mary Jones. Now, Mary Jones also deposed that she knew Elizabeth and Humphrey used to lay together. Now, William also said that Humphrey's servant Elizabeth was with child by Humphrey. So in addition to courting Ellen, he also had some sort of sexual relationship with his servant Elizabeth. And it would appear that Elizabeth had understood their relationship to be one of courtship. So if we think of this in terms of deviance, that Elizabeth allegedly set these fires likely would be considered deviant. But what about her pregnancy? As an unmarried woman in 1799, was she deviant? Or was her master who got her pregnant while courting another woman the deviant one? And of course, that's where it gets complicated. And it's by exploring these details that we get fascinating glimpses into the lives of average people in the past. So you're probably wondering what happened to Elizabeth. We have motive, we have opportunity, we have witnesses. So do you think she was convicted of arson, or do you think she was acquitted? No, normally if we were in person, I'd get a show of hands, but that's a bit difficult here. So I'm just going to do my big reveal, which is one of my favorite things. So I can tell you that Elizabeth pled not guilty, and she was found not guilty. So despite all of this evidence, she was not convicted of arson in this case. So if you'd like to engage with this sort of material at a more academic level, then please come study with us at the University of Leicester. So that's it for my talk. I can either take questions or let you go, or we can look at a couple of sources if you like, but that's me done the bulk of my talk there. So thank you.